Some types of weapons end up only in the hands of the gifted. Divine weapon. Such a weapon is the materialization of a person's soul, possessing unique abilities. A noble family once defeated an evil god. Ducal House of Catastrophe. People from this family are born with a golden spoon in their mouth. They have a strong body, incredible talent, and divine weapons. Bell was born into this family. Of course, he will become a hero who will proudly wield his sacred weapon. Or rather, it should have been that way. But at the oracle ceremony, where a person's divine weapon is determined, he received nothing. So he became the only loser in the entire history of their family. Now he was being bullied by the rest of the family, shouting at them to get out of here. The second son of the Catastrophe family, Zane, was particularly hostile towards him. He grabbed Bell by the hair and said that a non-entity like him, who was unable to summon divine weapons, had no place here. Poor beaten Bell was unable to utter a word, but only groaned in pain. Standing nearby were the youngest daughter Sarah and the eldest daughter Jessica. The eldest daughter watched with a smile, and the youngest was very worried. Sarah could not stand it and decided to help her brother. But her older sister put her foot forward, and because of this, Sarah fell. Jessica put her foot on her head and asked what she was up to. She was told to simply observe. Let her see what happens to non-entities like them. She's just a weak mudblood. Seeing this, Bell called out to his little sister in concern, but at that same second Zane pulled him higher by his hair and stabbed him in the stomach. This caused Bell to fall back to the ground and Zane sat on top of him. He started hitting him in the face and, calling him a mudblood with a smile, asked if he was sure he could handle it. He's just a mongrel, a little mongrel. At this time, Jessica also began to beat Sarah, and she and Zane said that they were just mongrels. They were the children of a concubine, so they were called rootless. They were bullied at every opportunity. After they got tired of beating them, Bell and Sarah were left alone. He bowed his head to her and said that it was all his fault. He needed to apologize. Sarah smiled and told him not to worry. She will always be there for him. Bell said her name quietly, and then said that he would become stronger, even without divine weapons. He looked up at her with a determined look and said that he promised it. He promises that he will protect her at the cost of his life. Hearing these words, she was delighted and immediately rushed into his arms, thanking him. But alas, he did not keep his promise. A few days later, he was kicked out of the house when there was heavy rain outside. The only thing on his back was a small bag. The gates of the estate closed behind him, and he raised his head up, allowing drops of rain to flow down his face, and cursed in his thoughts. He understood that without him, Sarah would be left completely alone with them. He needs strength. He has to get her out of there. Possession of ordinary weapons will do nothing against the one in whose hands the divine is located. So he must do everything to become stronger. He simply has no choice. He finally reached the city. The rain stopped. The first thing he did was run into the gun shop. He placed the bag of coins on the table with a ringing sound, and then poured them out and told the owner of the shop that he would take one type of each weapon. The man ran his fingers over the gold coins, counting them, and then looked up at Bell in surprise and asked, "Each type of weapon? Is he going to start a war?" 2 years have passed since then. Bell had already acquired a horse and was now galloping somewhere into the forest along with all the types of weapons that he had acquired earlier. His gaze was filled with determination for the upcoming battle. A whole horde of armed goblins was waiting for him ahead. Before the fight, Bell laid out all the weapons on the cloth, and then took the sword and mace and, looking at the monsters with a smile, said that he was starting. He swung his 2 weapons, cutting through the air, and then began quickly switching weapons while fighting the goblins. In this way, he killed everyone who attacked him, but suddenly steps were heard behind him. On the top of the rock stood a man in a white robe. His face was not visible under his hood. Having become interested in the young man, he called out to him and asked if he always carries so many weapons with him. He has to because there is no divine thing, right? Bell turned around in surprise when he heard the stranger's words, and he said that he had forgotten why he had set off. His task was to find a person to whom he could entrust this. He is looking for a person with great heroic potential. Bell turned his whole body towards him, looking at him with suspicion, and waiting for what would happen next. A bright flash lit up in the man's palm, Then he extended both hands forward and released a bright spark towards Bell, which forced him to cover his eyes with his hands from the bright light. As soon as the flash faded, Bell opened one eye and saw that in front of him stood a sheath stuck in the ground. Bell was surprised and even nervous, and the stranger said that he was giving it to him. Bell looked at the snow-white scabbard, which was decorated with gilded patterns and emitted blue sparks. Bell asked in disbelief, "Is this a sword?" He reached out with his hand to the scabbard, and then pulled it out of the ground and, having examined it more closely, exclaimed, "Is it just a scabbard?" But this was not an ordinary scabbard. It was the divine scabbard of Avalon, a one-of-a-kind divine weapon that allows you to store other divine weapons and transfer it to others. It is passed on from generation to generation, each time increasing its strength. Now it contains the weapons of 5 great heroes. If someone can master each of them, then the most powerful divine weapon in the world will be in the hands of a person. And that person should be Bell. 3 years have passed. Bell, together with a stranger in a white robe, stood on a high tower among the rocks, and a red dragon flew in the sky. The dragon growled, suddenly heading down, and then opened its mouth wide, releasing flames. Bell extended one hand forward and, igniting a bright blue flash, said that in fact, he did not care about these attacks. He summoned the scabbard of Avalon, and a second later it appeared in his hand. After that he lowered them down and, holding his other hand ready, told the weapon to appear. The snow-white sheath sparkled, bright blue flashes appeared near Bell's other hand, and after that, in an instant, Achilles' wind shield appeared. At that moment, the dragon flew close enough to strike and released hot flames from its mouth, and Bell covered himself with a shield, building a protective barrier. Following this, he immediately summoned the Holy Storm Hammer. He pulled his hand with the weapon back, preparing to jump, and then sharply jerked upward, raising the weapon above the dragon. He struck the dragon with his thunder hammer Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. Because of such force of the blow, the dragon was nailed with its muzzle to the tower, and after that the monster no longer moved. Bell walked away from the dragon and headed towards his mentor, putting away his sheath at the same time. The man said that he had already mastered Avalon. Let him go to his sister. Even an S-rank paladin will not be a hindrance for him. Bell was at first surprised by his words, and then he was delighted and said that he understood. He soon set out on his journey and thought that 5 years had passed since his exile. But now he had the power to protect his dear little sister. Let her just wait for him. He pursed his lips and thought that he was already on his way. Night fell and Bell saw bright flashes of flame and black smoke on the horizon that came from the duchy. He stopped on the rock, looking forward in horror, and thought, "What happened?" He approached, and among the flames he saw flags that fluttered in the wind. He realized that this was the coat of arms of the Duchy of Rothwinzer. He cautiously peeked around the corner, watching how people in armor were fighting among themselves. He thought, "Is this really a civil war?" But where is Sarah? He came to the family estate and, running along the glossy corridor, shouted that her brother had returned. Where is she? At the end of the corridor, he saw the doors open and thought that she must be there, but as soon as he walked inside, he was terrified. His sister lay next to the fallen column in a pool of her own blood. Bell froze in place, his face transformed, showing the feelings he was now experiencing. He abruptly took off, running up to his sister, and then lifted her up and began excitedly calling her name. But she didn't answer. He looked at her face. There was blood on her cheek. Her eyes were closed. Her lips did not move. All this indicated that she would never wake up. At that moment, Bell realized she was dead. He immediately remembered her words that she would always be by his side. Out of grief, he raised his head up and screamed loudly. Tears flowed from his eyes that fell over her body, and he exclaimed, "Why? Why did everything turn out this way? Why did he gain this power?" He promised that he would return and protect her. But suddenly a bright ray of light appeared from behind, headed forward and pierced Bell's chest right through. Blood gushed from his wound, and he wheezed in pain. Heavy footsteps were heard behind them. The enemy was slowly approaching Bell, and he thought that he recognized this mana. It seemed to be an S-rank divine weapon master. The stranger asked, "Is he Bell Catastrophe?" He had heard that he had been banished a long time ago. Blood flowed from Bell's mouth. He looked in his direction and thought, "Who is he?" Does he know him? The stranger said that it did not matter. He would soon be reunited with his beloved sister. Upon hearing this, Belle realized that it was he who killed Sarah. The man swung sharply and rushed towards him, saying that let him be a good brother and keep her company forever and ever. Belle turned around and shouted that he was a freak. How dare he? But he didn't even have time to do anything. The enemy's weapon again pierced his chest. He felt a burning pain and thought that he would die without even taking revenge. He won't accept it. A bright flash appeared in his eyes, and then he found himself in the cathedral and saw a priest in front of him. He looked at his hands and thought, where is he? He looked around and realized that this was the Catastrophe Cathedral. But how? Didn't he just die? The priest standing in front of him said that they were beginning the oracle ceremony. Belle thought in shock. Ceremony? What does it mean? Did he go back in time? The oracle asked him to stretch out his hands and present the divine weapons. Belle pursed his lips and thought, his divine weapon. He stretched out his hands and thought that at that moment he had not yet found Avalon. He will have to start again. He will be driven out again. But contrary to his expectations, a bright blue flash appeared in front of his hands, and he thought in surprise that this was impossible. A snow-white sheath appeared between his hands. There's no doubt about it. This is Avalon. He took the sheath and thought, he can start all over again, right? He will change fate with his power. This is how his real life will begin. The gilded pattern on his scabbard sparkled, and the priest was a little surprised and said that the divine scabbard was such a rarity. But unfortunately, Belle's friend interrupted him and asked if he couldn't fight with this. Is that what he thinks? The priest was slightly taken aback and replied that this was not so at all. Belle went back to the estate and told him not to worry. This was the best divine weapon in the entire world. He entered the estate and ran through the corridors, thinking that if he had returned to the past, then Sarah must be alive. She's probably in her room now. He pursed his lips as he walked towards her, and then ran to the door and went inside. Sarah was sitting on an armchair in the room, looking out the window. She heard the sound of the doors opening and immediately turned around, saying the name Belle with a smile. He saw her radiant smile and thought that it had been so long since he had seen his little sister. She is as he remembered her then. Sarah jumped up from her chair and joyfully ran up to him, and then asked how the ceremony went. What kind of weapon did he get? But instead of answering, Belle simply hugged her and thought that he was so glad that she was safe. Sarah hugged him back, smiled and asked if something was wrong. Belle remained silent, and in his thoughts he only apologized to her. He couldn't protect her in his previous life. He remembered how she was lying on the floor covered in blood and thought that this time he would not allow a tragedy. She would never experience pain or sadness again. He will not let her be offended. He continued to hug her, and she suddenly called out to him and said that she was in pain. Upon hearing this, Belle became very worried and let her go, apologizing to her. She took a step back and laughed, saying that everything was fine. His hugs make her happier. Suddenly, her voice became worried as she looked at his face. Tears flowed from Belle's eyes, and she asked, "Is he crying?" She patted him on the head and said that no matter what happened, everything would definitely be okay. Because he has her. Belle was surprised to hear these words, and then the door to the room suddenly burst open and Zane entered, saying that, as he saw, the mongrels got along well. He grinned and told Belle that he had found it. Sarah hid behind her brother, and he became wary and said the name Zane. Zane grinned and said that he heard everything. He hugged him and asked, "Something very interesting happened at the ceremony, right?" Belle thought that it seemed that the priest had told him everything, and that was why he had come to mock him. Belle lowered his head and said he got the scabbard. A bag came out of Zane's mouth, and then he couldn't help but laugh even harder, clutching his stomach and saying that he said sheath. It's not even a weapon, but for such a half-breed mongrel, it will do. He looked up at Belle and asked how he was going to fight with these scabbards. They're just a couple of idiots. In rage, Belle clenched his hand into a fist and said that he should take back his words. Zane frowned and asked, "Did he say something?" Belle looked up at him with determination and, raising his voice, said that he should take back his words. Zane got angry and he exclaimed, "How dare he dare him?" He clenched his hand into a fist and swung it, saying that he would teach him how to talk to elders properly. But this time, Bell did not endure. He clenched one hand into a fist, and then swung and hit Zane under the chest. From such a blow, he felt severe pain. Drool sprayed from his mouth, and he, no longer able to stand on his feet, fell to his knees and did not utter a word. Bell cocked his head and said he warned him. May he never dare to insult Sarah again. Zane looked up at him and shouted that he was an idiot. Blue sparks lit up in his palm, and he shouted that he should not play with him. A spear appeared in his hands, and he, getting into a fighting stance, said that he was a useless idiot. He will make him weep and ask for forgiveness. If he does not comply, he will roast him like a pig on a spit. Bell looked at the weapon and thought, flammable fire spear? Seriously, so be it. He extended his hand towards his sister and told her to step back. She called out to him worriedly, and then he patted her on the head and told her everything would be okay. He smiled slightly and said that she would leave it to him. He extended one hand to the side. Blue flashes sparkled from his hand, and he summoned Avalon. A snow-white sheath appeared in his hand, and Zane let out a chuckle and asked, does he really think that he can defeat him with this sheath? He's an E-rank paladin. He doesn't stand a chance. After these words, a flame appeared around his spear, and he pointed the tip towards Bell. Bell remained silent and thought that paladins were divided by rank depending on their strength. When a person first receives a divine weapon, he is assigned an F rank. As soon as mana can be poured into this weapon, rank E is assigned. D rank can use special attacks. In order for a paladin to rise to rank, he needs to awaken the unique abilities of divine weapons. Bell frowned and thought that he was so proud that he achieved E rank at the age of 14, but he still had room to grow. He grinned and Zane got even angrier, shouting, what is he laughing at? Bell looked at him with a grin and said he was being cute. These words made Zane even angrier. He swung his spear. A hot flame flared up around him, and he shouted that he was just a mudblood. He will show where his place is. Seeing this, Sarah was greatly afraid for her brother and called out to him. But he raised his other hand to the scabbard and told the sword of light to appear. Immediately after this, with a light and quick movement, he pulled out the Caliburn sword from its sheath and in an instant cut off the tip of Zane's spear. Zane did not expect this. His face darkened, and he looked at Caliburn and thought, what kind of sword is this? Unable to stay on his feet, he fell to the floor, and the severed tip of his spear flew up and then fell down, piercing the floor between his legs. This made Zane hiccup in fear. Cold sweat ran down his face, and he thought that this was impossible. The scabbard was empty. Bell approached him and asked what now. Will he make him cry and beg for forgiveness? Zane looked up at him and shouted that he had tricked him. If he knew he had a weapon. He rose to his feet, leaning on the wall, and said that he couldn't get away with this so easily. After that, he quickly headed towards the exit of the room, and Bell, again raising his hand to the sheath, asked where he was going. They haven't agreed yet. A flaming Ragnarok pistol appeared in his hand. He took aim and shot at Zane, who was trying to hide in the corridor. There was a loud sound of a shot. The bullet flew past Zane's face and hit the wall, leaving a hole there. Zane froze in shock. He looked at the hole he had just made in the wall, and then fearfully turned his gaze towards Bell. He saw the gun in his hand and thought why. Did he just have a sword in his hands? He couldn't have multiple divine weapons. Bell lowered his gun and took a step towards him, telling him to never contact Sarah or him again. He raised the gun again and took aim, telling him to remember it. Zane became very worried about the threat that came from Bell, and he said that if he touched her again, he would put a bullet in his forehead. After that, Zane screamed loudly in fear and hurried to hide, and Bell sighed and put away his weapon. Sarah, who was standing behind, opened her mouth in surprise. Bell walked up to her and asked if she was okay. She replied that she was so afraid that he would beat them again. It was his divine weapon, right? Bell asked if he didn't say he'd figure it out. Sarah smiled and said he was incredible. Bell looked at her smile and frowned, thinking that he wouldn't let anyone wipe the smile off her face. Meanwhile, Zane reported everything to his father. The Duke asked, "Is this true?" Zane excitedly called him his lord and confirmed his words. His father, Duke Catastrophe, Gallium Catastrophe, who was sitting on the chair, looked away and said that he understood. Bell received several divine weapons. Zane got down on one knee and said that he had an unusual weapon. He must have made a deal with the devil. They must expel him now. The Duke smoothed his beard and said thoughtfully that this was interesting. He got up from his chair and walked past his son, which surprised him. He immediately turned in his direction and asked where he was going. Galleon replied that he was going to visit Belle. He smiled slightly and said that he needed to see everything with his own eyes. Belle managed to return to his room at this time and plopped down on the bed with a sigh. He hugged his pillow and thought that he managed to defeat Zane, but he was still in the body of a child. He looked at his small palm and thought that he had completely lost his strength. He has difficulty controlling his mana. He was going to shoot a fire bullet, but it only came out as an ordinary one. Now he is only strong at the F rank level. He closed his eyes and said that this couldn't go on any longer. He remembered the day of his death. Then the Rothwinzer family attacked them. Rothwinzer is another famous family that has had a long feud with Catastrophe. The reasons for their attack could be anything. He looked at his hand that he extended to the ceiling and thought that he was sure that that dark silhouette that killed him and Sarah was one of the Rothwinzer family. This time he will protect his sister. He clenched his hand into a fist and thought that for this, he needed to raise his status in this house. As soon as he thought about it, the doors to his room opened with a creak. He turned his gaze in that direction, and the Duke entered the room, saying that they had not seen him for a long time. Belle jumped out of bed excitedly and thought, "Dad? But why?" Galleon Catastrophe, in a great battle that took place 20 years ago, he fought alone with the evil god and the famous monster Tartaros. He walked his way through the dark continent where monsters live. It was nicknamed the Holy Sword of Genesis. Zane followed the Duke into the room. Belle looked at him and thought that he understood everything. It means he knows something. Zane remained standing at the door, and the Duke approached Belle, and he thought that this was even good. The best way to improve his status is to get his father to pay attention to him. He knelt before him and said that they had not seen him for a long time. The Duke looked down at him and said that he had really changed. Today he came here as his father, so he invites them to talk. Belle looked up at him and replied that he was afraid. One wrong word and the conversation will spin out of control. They must be held accountable for their actions and words. His father let out a thoughtful sigh and then extended his hand in his direction and told him to get up. Belle obeyed the order, and his father, emitting a terrifying aura from himself, said that if he believed so, then he would support him. Feeling the change in the atmosphere in the room, he wondered what kind of pressure this was. What an intimidating look he has. The Duke turned to his two sons and asked, "They had a fight, right?" He banned fighting in his house, so why did he hurt the brother he should respect? This time he turned to Belle, but he became very worried and remained silent. Zane, who was standing behind his father, chuckled quietly and in his thoughts told Belle that this was the end. No one in this house can resist father. Belle noticed his mocking look and frowned. Then he turned his gaze to his father and said that he was angry because he had insulted his little sister. The Duke's face darkened a little, and he said that he understood him. And he broke the rules because of a petty offense. Belle confirmed his words and confidently added that he does not regret it. His father squeezed the scabbard on his belt tighter and asked if he regretted breaking his rules. Belle answered with confidence that abandoning those he loves is a real shame for a paladin. He will protect his sister even if the enemy is his older brother. Listening to him, the Duke suddenly frowned, and then Belle said that this was his chosen path as a knight. The Duke immediately grabbed the hilt of the sword, pulled the weapon out of its sheath, and pointed the tip straight at Belle's throat. After that he asked, even if his opponent was him. Belle answered confidently that this was true, even if he were his opponent. Even after hearing these words, the Duke's face did not change. Suddenly he smiled slightly and said that he liked it. He waved his hand and said that he would act as if nothing had happened. Zane clearly didn't expect this. He exclaimed, "Why?" His father turned to him and asked displeasedly. He not only lost to his brother in a duel, but also bullied his sister. These words of his father caused a slight trembling in his body. He was afraid. The Duke said that he was a disgrace. Let him not show himself to him. Zane left the room, but the Duke remained and told Belle that he understood him. And it was a brave act to express your opinion, knowing what could follow. Bel lowered his head and asked for his forgiveness, but the Duke told him not to apologize. For a member of the Catastrophe family, this is fine. Now, he wants him to show him his strength. Let him draw his divine weapon. Bel bowed his head and agreed. After that, he extended his 2 hands forward and blue sparks appeared between them, and the Duke seemed to get a little worried when he saw this. A sheath appeared between Bel's hands, and he said that this was his divine weapon, Avalon. The Duke was surprised and thought, is it necessary? This is impossible. He had heard about the legendary divine weapon, which contained the spirit of the first paladin. That very divine weapon passed down from generation to generation by the greatest heroes. He folded his arms and said that Zane said he used both a sword and a gun. This is true. Bel confirmed his words, and then lifted the sheath slightly and said that they were both inside the sheath. He summoned his sword and pistol, and they appeared in the air from bright blue flashes. The Duke looked up and thought in surprise, did he pull out a divine weapon from its sheath? What is this? Bel said that he can use 2 weapons at the same time, but there are 3 more types. This made the Duke even more surprised. He looked at Bel's face and thought that he couldn't even believe it. His son was a future hero. Bel hid the weapon, and his father told him honestly that he was not interested in weaklings. He will expect a lot from him. Bel's face took on a surprised look, and the Duke came out of his room and said that he should work harder. The doors slammed behind him, and after that Bel sat down on the floor by the bed and sighed with relief, thinking that he was pressing so hard with his aura. But now he expects a lot from him. He must show his strength. Even though he is still a child, he needs to get D rank as soon as possible. And he must defeat as many monsters as possible, increasing his mana. He confidently clenched his hand into a fist and said that he would start by hunting orcs in the forest. Night came. In the dark forest in the middle of the clearing, a severed head of an orc appeared with wounds from claws. Suddenly some beast stepped on this head. Blood splashed in all directions, and a blue tail appeared above the pool of blood and the green bodies of the orcs. A large wolf walked past the corpses, its snow-white fur on its paws and belly was bloody. The animals bared their teeth, showing sharp fangs stained with blood. Then the wolf turned sharply, growling loudly, and his snow-white fur was illuminated by the light of the moon. In the morning, Bel went into the forest and said that the forest brought back memories. After he was kicked out of his home in his previous life, he trained here for a while. He walked on and said it was strange. He went to the very depths. Where are all the monsters? He did not notice the red eyes that were peeking out from the bushes and went on, saying that he had never even met an orc the whole way. But suddenly he froze in place when he saw blood and severed limbs of monsters on the ground ahead. He realized that something was wrong here and got scared. Suddenly the steps of a 4-legged animal and heavy breathing were heard behind. Bel immediately turned around at the sound and managed to react, drawing his sword and blocking the blow. The huge wolf jumped to the side, and the recoil threw Bel back and he fell to the ground. He looked forward and exclaimed, "What is this?" A huge wolf came out to meet him, his red eyes sparkling, and Bel exclaimed that he thought so. It was Fenrir. Now he understood the reason why he didn't meet any monsters. He only wanted to hunt orcs, not run into a D-rank monster. He has almost no mana. At best his strength is that of E rank. To be honest, he would like to just run away, his heels sparkling. But if he just turns away, Fenrir will immediately kill him. All this time, while Bel was thinking, Fenrir was watching him closely. At one moment, the wolf's pupils narrowed and Bel realized that he was going on the attack. The wolf rushed towards him and he thought it was too fast. To avoid the blow, he decided to jump to the side, and he succeeded. Fenrir ran past. While Bel was falling, he pulled out a Ragnarok pistol and flipped in the air, landing on the ground, and then fired twice. But Fenrir was too fast. He avoided the bullets. Bel cursed as his attack failed and, summoning another weapon, thought that his bullets were too slow due to lack of mana. A sword appeared in his hand, and he thought that if the gun didn't work, then this might work. Immediately after that, he rushed forward, and Fenrir ran towards him. As he approached, he swung his paw sharply to attack, but Bel managed to avoid this by moving to the side. As soon as he was at the side of the beast, he swung his sword and thought that he needed to act right now. He attacked. but Fenrir immediately retreated and then turned to his opponent. Bel was greatly surprised by this maneuver. They stood opposite each other, and he became worried, thinking that in the past he could have easily killed him. Fenrir charged again, baring his teeth and swinging his paw, and Bel thought that in this guise he would not be able to keep up with him. He blocked the attack. He was able to defend himself from the main damage, but was still wounded. A cut appeared on his leg from the wolf's claws. Bel clenched his teeth, felt pain, and then the wolf began to circle around him, delivering new attacks. Bel reflected the blows and thought that everything was bad. He couldn't dodge. The wolf attacked again, but this time Bel was unable to parry the blow, and then he saw a huge open mouth right in front of his face. Bel was scared. He had just reincarnated. He definitely won't die here. He summoned the Achilles shield and put it forward, but contrary to his expectations, the wolf jumped over it and Bel followed him with his gaze. He didn't have time to do anything. Fenrir attacked him from behind, pushing him to the side. Bel was unable to stand on his feet from the blow and fell to the ground, letting go of the weapon. His shield and sword fell nearby, and he, trying to catch his breath, thought that if everything continued like this, he would die. The wolf slowly walked towards him, and he thought that his sword, pistol, and shield were useless. He is sure that he will not strike with a hammer. Only one weapon remains. He clutched his sore shoulder and said that he had no choice. He would have to use it. The wolf seemed to sense an emanating threat and immediately rushed to attack, sharply accelerating and growling. Bel remained standing and closed his eyes when the wolf swung its paw at him. Immediately after this, he opened his eyes and called upon Aegis. Fenrir attacked, but with his paw, he only dispelled the purple haze that appeared near Bel's hand. After the blow, the wolf stood up, looking intently at Bel, on whose hand there was now a glove that exuded a purple haze. Bel said that he really didn't want to use it, but in this situation he couldn't do otherwise. The wolf took one step towards him, and then sharply accelerated and growled. Bel noticed that the wolf became faster, but that didn't matter. As soon as Fenrir approached him and opened his mouth to sink his fangs into his small body, Bel quickly dodged and climbed onto the wolf's back. He threw the hammer over his shoulder and apologized to Fenrir, saying that he could not hit him again. He looked at the wolf with a determined look, and then swung his hammer and hit Fenrir right in the face. After the blow, the beast growled loudly, spraying saliva, and Bel hurried to descend to the ground. His weapon is the Aegis, the glove of darkness. It increases a person's physical abilities in an instant. But not only that, it also starts the process of destruction. As soon as Bel thought this, his glove glowed red, his eyes turning the same color. Fenrir went on the attack again, growling loudly. Over time, the glove's reinforcement becomes stronger. Bel looked at the wolf and told him to say goodbye with his life. He smiled, calling Fenrir a pathetic mongrel, and said that he should try to attack him. Fenrir attacked, but Bel immediately put the hammer in his mouth, interrupting the attack, and then moved to the side and swung, striking. Then he jumped sharply and, landing on Fenrir's head, struck with his hammer. While he was beating the wolf, a wide smile appeared on his face. Time passed. The wolf finally died and was now lying on the ground. Bel sighed, looking at Fenrir, and said that thank God he dealt with him quickly. The glove on his hand disappeared, and he thought that the dark divine weapon had special abilities. The more time passes in battle, the deeper it sucks the owner into the abyss of darkness. He sat down next to Fenrir's muzzle and thought, where does Fenrir come from in the forest? He's sure he wasn't here before. No matter, there's no point in him worrying about it. The hammer that he placed on the ground suddenly sparkled, and he began to think. Suddenly, he realized something. After defeating Fenrir, he can use its attributes. Hunting strong monsters is more effective than hunting entire hordes of weak ones. He is looking forward to trying out new powers. Time passed. Not far from the estate, in the shade of a tall tree, Sarah sat and hummed a melody. She happily held up the flower crown and said that she was finally finished. She laughed and wondered if her brother would like it. Suddenly, someone snatched the wreath from her hands, and she got scared. Jessica twirled the wreath, examining it, and exclaimed, "What kind of nonsense is this?" "Flower crown." She grinned and said that a half-breed like her would be suitable. Sarah called out to Jessica in fear, and she, showing the crown to her servant Spencer, asked what he thought about it. He smiled and replied that the words she said were true. Then Jessica threw him the crown and said his name, and he realized what he needed to do. He swung his whip and immediately cut the flower crown into 2 parts. Flower petals scattered through the air, and Spencer's blue whip sparkled in the sun. Seeing this, Sarah gasped in confusion, and then her sister extended 2 fingers in her direction and said that she was incredibly bored, so she offered to have fun. A gun appeared in her hand, which she pointed at her, and then smiled and said that it was time for shooting practice. She fired a shot, and Sarah, hearing the loud sound, closed her eyes and cowered in fear. Belle quickly came to her aid and deflected the bullet with his scabbard, saying that they could play together since she was already bored. Sarah turned her surprised gaze to Belle, and he smiled and said that he was just looking for an opportunity to test his divine weapon. Jessica called out to Spencer in displeasure and ordered him to quickly deal with this garbage. Spencer waved his whip and replied with a smile that he understood. When his whip hit the grass, a piece of ice immediately appeared in that place. Belle looked at his opponent with displeasure. Spencer Gray, he is a D-rank paladin whose divine weapon is Ice Whip. He is much stronger than Zane, who only has an E rank. Belle frowned at Spencer, and he said that it would freeze his legs and he wouldn't be able to escape anywhere. And then his arms and torso, so that he wouldn't lift a finger. With a nasty grin, he stretched the whip and said that after this, it would disfigure his face beyond recognition. Belle interrupted him and said that he could only make speeches. His voice became more furious. He said that he would suffer for Sarah's tears. Spencer chuckled and called him an asshole and said that he shouldn't look at him like that. He waved his whip and shouted that he would soon turn into an icicle. The icy tip of the whip snaked towards Belle, but he dodged it in time, recoiling to the side, and the whip hit the ground. Jessica was very surprised by this and asked, "Has he returned?" Spencer continues to swing the whip, and Belle dodges. He thought that for a D rank, he was pretty good with his weapons. While dodging, he suddenly smiled and thought that compared to the training he had undergone in his past life, this was kindergarten. Sarah, meanwhile, watched him and said admiringly that this was incredible. It's like he's dancing. Spencer started to get angry at this and said irritably that he was just running away. Belle asked, "Is he running away?" He smiled and said that so be it. He wouldn't dodge anymore. All 3 were very surprised by his words and began to wait for what would happen next. Belle looked at Spencer with a cheeky smile and confident eyes and said that he was wondering how he was going to turn him into an icicle or whatever it was he was saying. Spencer leaned forward and shouted that he was an idiot. He's even dumber than he thought. If that's what he wants, he'll freeze him dead. He sharply waved his hand and the tip of the whip headed towards Belle, but he only spread his arms to the side, showing that he was ready to take the blow. While the whip was beating on his body, he looked at Spencer with a smile, without taking his eyes off him. Noticing that he was not doing anything, Sarah called out to him in concern. From the blows of the whip, Belle's legs were frozen in ice. His body and hands were also frozen, but he continued to be inactive. Spencer smiled and said that he was now immobilized. He wanted to say something else, but Belle interrupted him and asked, "Is that all he can do?" He smiled and said it was his turn now. The smile on Spencer's face disappeared, and he became wary. After that, Belle looked at his icy hand and called for Ragnarok. The snow-white sheath on his belt sparkled, and after that Ragnarok appeared in his hand, breaking the ice. Spencer was surprised and said that this was impossible. Second divine weapon? Belle pointed the gun to his other hand and released his mana. Then he fired, and with a loud ringing sound, the gun bullet pierced the ice. He freed himself from the icy shackles and said that he could move again. Jessica was very surprised and worried at this time. She didn't believe what she saw. She thought, why does he have 2 weapons? How can it use attributes? Belle pointed the gun at Spencer and said it was time to pay for what he had done. A flame appeared at the tip of the gun's muzzle and Spencer cursed, becoming very nervous. To protect himself, he made an unexpected decision. He hit the ground near him with his whip, and a huge piece of ice immediately grew in front of him, which served as a shield for him. He laughed and asked what now. Let him try to hit him through this thickness of ice. Belle replied that it was as easy as shelling pears. Immediately after these words, he fired. The fiery bullet headed forward and pierced a thick piece of ice, heading straight for Spencer. Before his eyes, he saw a bright flash and did not have time to do anything. A fiery bullet hit him in the stomach, and he screamed in pain. The blow threw him back, and he fell next to Jessica, who was very frightened. She became worried and thought that he had broken through the ice. Is he really stronger than D rank? She only has an E rank, no chance. Belle walked towards her, and she froze in place with fear. Belle said it was over. Out of fear, Jessica stretched her hand forward and called for the gun. She pointed the weapon at him, her whole body trembling with fear, and she told him to go away. She pulled the trigger several times, firing bullets at Belle, but he did not react to it at all. They all flew past. Unable to defend herself, Jessica backed away and told him to get away from her. But suddenly she stumbled and fell to the ground, bursting with pain. Belle walked up to her, and she looked up at him with a frightened look. In her eyes he was a terrifying black spot, with blue sparkling eyes. Belle looked at her threateningly and said that she should not dare to approach Sarah again. Jessica's eyes faded with fear and tears appeared. Unable to bear his gaze, she immediately jumped to her feet and ran towards the estate, screaming loudly in fear. Sarah then ran up to Belle and hugged him tightly in gratitude for her protection. Belle was a little surprised, and she asked if he was okay. He's not injured, is he? He replied that everything was fine. The main thing is that she is intact. She smiled and said he was so strong. He also smiled at her and said that he would become even stronger to protect her. Suddenly Sarah remembered about the flower crowns and handed him one, saying that she made the wreaths. True, there is no longer one, but let him take the one she made for herself. He ducked down and she placed a wreath on his head and thanked him for always protecting her. Belle felt a flower wreath on his head and thought, a gift from Sarah. He smiled widely and thought that the whole nation would one day honor this. But there are still some problems. Even the knights despise them for being the children of a concubine. And even though Jessica and Zane were defeated, it wouldn't change anything. They will start bullying Sarah again. As her sibling, he must show his status in the house to protect her. That's all he needs now. Time passed, and the Duke was training not far from the estate. He held his sword at the ready and closed his eyes to concentrate. He heard the fluttering of tree leaves in the air and suddenly swung his sword sharply, cutting the leaf into thin pieces. Belle, whom he had just noticed, appeared behind him. He asked what he needed. Belle replied that he wanted to ask his permission. The Duke asked why. Belle knelt before him, and the Duke looked down at him and waited. Belle looked up at him with confidence and asked him for permission to take the C rank exam. The Duke asked, so he wants to take the exam. Belle confirmed his words and said that he wanted to serve the king as a member of their family. He thought that in exchange for the royal family's recognition of their status, they were obliged to do their bidding. Usually the task is given along the lines of protecting important individuals, destroying monsters, and so on. The fastest way to increase his status in the family is to receive achievements for difficult tasks. And to accept them, he needs a higher rank. His father asked if he wanted to serve. He sees he is full of ambition. He looked at him with a cold gaze and said that it was too early. He needs to become a full paladin before reaching C rank. Hearing this, Belle began to untie the knot of the bag that he was carrying on his back. His father said that now he only has F rank. He just received his weapon. If he wants to increase his rank, then he should start with the E rank exam. Belle untied the bag and took out a fang from it. Then he put it on the ground and asked with a smile if this would change his mind. The Duke was surprised and thought, Fenrir's fang. He asked suspiciously how he got it. Belle extended one hand forward, summoning a weapon, and a hammer appeared next to him, sparkling. Then he threw it over his shoulder and said with a smile that with difficulty, but he managed to defeat this mongrel. The Duke was very surprised and thought, can he use attributes? This means that he received special features for weapons and defeated Fenrir alone. Belle is clearly stronger than C rank. After a few seconds of thought, he told his son that he would allow him to take the exam, and let him not dare to disappoint him. Did he understand it? Belle replied with a confident smile that of course he wouldn't do that. Time passed and Belle arrived at the square where all the examinees had gathered. One of them sighed and said that there are so many applicants, probably for many. C rank is a kind of ceiling. They say there are casualties every year. Is he wondering how the exam is going? Bell walked past these guys, and they followed him with surprised glances. The guy asked, "Is there a child here?" Bell approached the girl who was accepting applications and asked, "Do they accept applications here?" When she saw the child, she was confused and asked who he was. "Does he have an attendant?" Bell replied that he wanted to take the exam. At these words, the girl was very surprised and slammed her palms on the table, and then apologized and said that she thought he would have to come back later, when he grew up. Bell, with a slight irritation in his voice, said that even if she did not treat him like a child, he was also a paladin. The girl wanted to object, but a guy appeared next to them and said that he should stop playing paladin. Bell turned around and saw a red-haired guy in a raincoat who said that little children do not belong here. Let him get out of here. When he saw him, Bell suddenly felt something was wrong and thought, "Who is this guy?" It won't be easy for him to deal with. The rest of the exam participants paid attention to this guy, and one of them asked if it was him. This is the strongest D-rank paladin Lennox Bright. His divine weapon is the wind sword, which is said to strike 8 times with each swing. Incredible, right? He's a big fan. Lennox heard them discussing him and smiled smugly. He then turned to Bell and said that if he wanted to get C rank, then he had to be at least a little strong like him. Bell became wary and thought, does this mean he is the strongest at this rank? Lennox, he walked up to Bell and bent down, matching his face, and then asked if he even had a divine weapon. Bell showed him the Avalon sheath and said that of course he had a weapon. Seeing the scabbard, Lennox burst out laughing, and then couldn't stand it and laughed harder, throwing his head back. He exclaimed, "What is this? Sheath?" He doesn't believe it's his weapon. It's just trash. The other examinees also laughed, and one of them asked, "Is there really such a useless divine weapon?" The girl standing next to him said that thank God she was not born so worthless. The smile on Lennox's face disappeared. He looked at Bell with an arrogant look and said that he didn't mind if the ignorant child wanted to die here. He twirled a lock of hair around his finger with a smile and said that he did not like that his participation in this exam could not put them on equal terms. He went to the arena and finally waved his hand at him, saying that he should run to his mommy. Bell ignored this and approached the girl again, telling her to register him immediately. She still asked in surprise, "Is he serious?" Bell confirmed her words, and then she said that to participate you need to be a D-rank paladin, or receive a letter of recommendation from a paladin of B rank or higher. Bell handed her the letter and said that with this letter he would definitely be able to participate. That's what the rules say. The girl unfolded the letter and thought, who would recommend this child? But when she read the letter, she was very surprised and thought, this is the same letter from Duke Galleon Catastrophe. Is this boy really the son of a duke? So Bell registered for the exam and went into the arena, where the knights stood on a small platform. One of them came forward and said that he would explain how the C-rank exam works. First, they will go to the dungeon using the teleportation stone. They then need to return the light gem on the 5th floor within 5 hours. There are 3 of these stones in total. 3 people who complete the task will receive a C rank. One of the examinees asked, "Only 3 people?" Lennox said with a smug smile that he would become one of them. The rest of the exam participants looked at him strangely and remained silent. Bell looked at him and the knight asked, "Is everyone ready?" In response, all the examinees joyfully raised their weapons up, and the knight said that then the exam begins. It was Bell's turn to teleport, and he climbed onto the platform, extending his hand forward. He touched the teleportation stone, and the engraved mark on it glowed, teleporting Bell. He immediately found himself in a completely different space and began to fall down. A second later, a bright flash appeared in the cave, from which Bell emerged. He glanced around, rose to his feet, and thought that it seemed they had been sent to different places on this floor. And where should he go? He walked further along the corridor and thought that the dungeon was huge, but 5 hours would be enough to clear it. He has a chance. The main thing is not to waste time. There are many monsters in the dungeon. The paladin's mana becomes stronger depending on the number of monsters killed. With this thought, Bell took out his sword, and then prepared for battle and said with a smile that it was time to kill them all. At this time, several paladins formed a group and together fought with the armed lizards that stood in their way. The lizard was the first to attack, attacking one of them, but he managed to dodge in time. The monster's red eyes sparkled in the twilight of the cave, and he opened his mouth slightly, showing sharp teeth. From this sight, the paladins were frightened and froze in place, but suddenly Lennox's voice was heard somewhere nearby, saying that they were so pitiful. With just a swing of his wind sword, he cut the monster into several pieces, and then smiled, looking at the paladins. The guy was delighted and said that he was such a great guy, and the girl said with admiration that she was ready to fall in love with him. After that, Lennox went to the rest of the monsters. He swung his sword and again dismembered the lizard, and then annoyedly told the paladins that he was not like them. He walked further down the corridor, and they followed him, and the guy said that it was a pity, but unfortunately, this is how it is. The girl said that thanks to him, they were able to get through. Lennox laughed and said that then let them look at him with envy. He turned to them with a grin and said that weaklings better act like weaklings. At this rate, they reached the huge door at the end of the corridor. The team stopped, looking at the tall door, and Lennox said that this was the last room. He came closer and, opening the door, said that he hoped there was something interesting there. As soon as the doors opened, inside the room they saw several types of monsters at once, and one of them shouted that there were so many D-rank monsters here. Someone from the team noticed an altar at the end of the room, on which lay 3 blue shining stones, and warned the others about it. Noticing the people, the stone golem began to move towards them. Lennox decided to go on the attack first, and said that he would smash them to pieces again. He swung his sword and struck several wind blows, but it had no effect on the monster. He continued to move forward and Lennox exclaimed, "Is he hard?" The stone golem immediately swung and hit Lennox in the face with all its strength, causing him to fly back and roll on the ground. After the blow, he caught his breath and looked up at the bridge, exclaiming in surprise, "His sword doesn't cut through." The other paladins were very surprised by this and wondered how this could happen. The monsters began to attack them from all sides, and they exclaimed that they were now attacking them too. The guy swung his mace and then hit the monster right on the head, breaking his head into 2 parts. But as soon as he raised his weapon, the monster immediately recovered. The guy exclaimed, "What does this mean? Don't such blows work on him?" The girl, meanwhile, was waving a fiery sword, trying to reach the harpy, who was nailed to the ceiling. She shouted that she couldn't reach her with the sword, but suddenly the harpy sharply flapped her wings, directing a powerful stream of air into her and blew out her fire. Because of the wind, she could not stand on her feet, and meanwhile Lennox was just getting to his feet and thinking, "Is this the last room of the exam for rank C?" He looked at the stone golem that was right in front of him and thought that there were only monsters with resistance to 1 weapon. The stone golem approached him again and raised his hand to hit him, and Lennox, realizing that he could not injure him, closed his eyes and thought that they would kill them. But Bell arrived in time to them. He swung his hammer and easily smashed the stone golem into small fragments. Hearing a loud sound from the impact, Lennox opened his eyes and was very surprised to see Bell in front of him, which said that he was almost late. He put his foot on the golem's head with a smile and said that he was too carried away with farming. Lennox exclaimed that he was the same boy. He still continued to look at him in surprise, but suddenly a slime monster appeared behind Bell and was heading straight towards them. Bell's hand sparkled with blue sparks. He took out his sword and rushed to attack. Lennox saw another weapon in his hands and exclaimed in surprise, "Has his weapon changed?" At this time, Bell swung his sword, cutting off the upper half of the monster's body. At this time, the harpy also decided to attack him. She began to flap her wings, throwing off sharp fragments. Bell took out a gun and pointed it at her. He pulled the trigger several times, firing bullets into her, which made several large holes in her body. The paladin stood aside at that time, and the guy asked, "Is he serious?" The girl asked in surprise, "Is his weapon not just a sword?" Lennox continued to watch him and wondered where he got so many weapons from. He also knows them well. Bell began fighting with 2 weapons at once, holding a sword in one hand and a pistol in the other. He walked towards the other monsters and said that there was almost no time left. They needed to finish this quickly. After these words, he began to circle around the room, dealing with monsters with a sword and at the same time firing fire bullets at them. Lennox continued to watch him and was shocked to think that he did not look like a child. Soon Bell dealt with all the monsters around, and finally he cut off the upper part of the body of the last monster. He began to climb the stairs leading to the altar, and the others continued to watch him in surprise. He went upstairs and, looking at the 3 sparkling spheres, asked, "Are these the light spheres?" The rest of the examinees followed him up and asked with admiration how he could defeat them alone. "How does he carry so many weapons?" Bell didn't answer, he just looked at them with a dissatisfied look. The paladins looked at Lennox and said irritably that compared to him, he acted so self-confident, but he lost. "He's just a weakling." The guy said it was true. It wasn't cool at all. Lennox looked very tired. In response to their words, he only remained silent and looked down. The others suddenly remembered the spheres and said that they were now rank C. Suddenly Bell decided to summon his hammer, and then he looked at the remaining spheres on the altar. He swung his hammer sharply and then hit the altar, shattering all the remaining spheres. The rest of the paladins were greatly surprised by his actions and, looking at the destroyed altar, exclaimed, "What did he do? Why did he break everything?" Bell showed them the sphere he had taken earlier and said that there was only one left here. If they want it, let them take it. He looked at the paladins with a dissatisfied look and said that they were scum who were incapable of anything other than flattering the strong. He then turned his gaze to Lennox, who stood hesitantly next to him, and said that he was a scumbag who happily humiliated others. All of them are not worthy to be called knights. These words surprised Lennox and put the others to shame. They all remained silent, and Bell began to go downstairs. Suddenly Lennox said that he understood. He is a weakling, but he was so self-confident. He's grateful that he made him notice it. He looked at him with a determined look and said that he still wouldn't stop. Bell glanced at him and thought he was being honest and full of ambition. He didn't expect this. He confidently walked towards the exit and said that he understood. Then they would meet again someday. After leaving the dungeon, Bell finally received C rank. He sat down on the stone fence and looked at his hand with a smile, saying that thanks to the monsters, his magical power had become stronger. He looked up and thought that only Sarah remained. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Duke Catastrophe gathered a council. The man said that he understood everything. So the knightly organization Karma is plotting a royal coup. The Duke confirmed his words and said that they were approaching their kingdom with 3 knights of rank B at their head. Their destruction is the mission of the Catastrophe family. The man said that it looked like they had already defeated Duke Slave's platoon. Another man sitting nearby asked in surprise, "Is that Duke's platoon Slave? They say they strengthen their weapons with the forbidden book of pentagrams. That's why they, knights of rank B, gathered here." The Duke agreed and said that they need to keep their eyes open. They will defeat them. The man looked at the empty chair in front of him and asked, "Where is Jean?" Suddenly the door swung open and someone threw a book of pentagrams on their table. The young man turned to his father and asked, "So this is what he was talking about." All those present turned their surprised glances towards the door. There stood a long-haired young man who exuded a dark aura and said with a smile that he had recently destroyed this organization. He will be the next Duke. Time passed. A maid came to Sarah's room and put a tray of bread and water on the table, saying that this was her lunch. After that, she rolled the cart back to the exit, and Sarah smiled awkwardly and thanked her. The maid did not pay attention to her and walked on, and after that the door closed. As soon as she left, the smile on Sarah's face faded, and she looked upset at the bread in front of her. She lowered her gaze, sadly continuing to think about something of her own. But suddenly the door to the room opened and Bell came inside with a box in his hands, telling her that he had returned. He looked at her with a smile, and she, seeing him, was very happy and clapped her hands, calling him. She also jumped out of bed and ran up to him, asking where he was. She was so worried. He apologized to her and said that he had business to do. In return, he brought her something. He laid out on the table the fried chicken, the pie and the apples that he had brought her in a box. Sarah was very happy and clapped her hands, saying that this was an apple pie. She thanked him and invited him to eat it all together. Belle looked at her smile and thought she was so cute. but there is no time to be moved. He looked at the tray and thought that, as usual, they brought her a simple lunch. Probably because the old servants don't like the concubine's children. Sarah began to eat the pie with tears in her eyes, and Belle thought that he needed to quickly start working to improve her life. The meeting was still going on at this time. The Duke looked at his son and asked, did he defeat Karma alone? He named him Jin and said that he had achieved a rank. Jin, the eldest son of the Catastrophe family, smiled, and next to him stood his servant named Laser. The men smiled and said that this was to be expected from the eldest son of the Duke of Galleon. The man sitting next to him agreed and said that they live in different worlds. Jin wearily took his seat and then asked, so what? Is today's topic closed? His father replied that this was not so. There was another mission from the king. This is a mission to protect Princess Reichstagverin. Lady Reich must travel soon. Their job is to give her a knight to guard her and make her a safe passage. The man asked, are there not enough knights from the palace? Laser said that if it weren't for Karma, there wouldn't have been a need for security. The man said that then they could do it. He thinks the safest route will be through Mount Rakota. Suddenly, there were footsteps in the corridor. Belle entered the meeting room and loudly asked them to wait. All eyes immediately turned to him and silence reigned in the room. The man looked at him in surprise and asked, young Master Belle? The Duke smiled slightly when he saw him, but the smile quickly disappeared and he said that it looked like the exam was already over. Belle showed him the document confirming this and told him that he had received rank C. The others were very surprised and exclaimed, at this age, rank C. The Duke asked boredly, so what? What does he want? Belle replied that he had some advice about the route. The man asked in disbelief, did he have any advice? Belle said that there are no monsters on Mount Rakota, but it is an excellent place for bandits to hide. And if they travel along a road in the mountains, it will take 3 days to travel. He thinks they should drive through the monster meadow. The man exclaimed displeasedly, a meadow of monsters? This is a nest of monsters. Belle replied that this was not the case. Only mostly dead chimeras and dark spirits live in this meadow. These two types of monsters are mainly active at night. If they go during the day, it will be safe. This way they can reach their destination in just a day. After listening to his proposal, the man thoughtfully said that it was true. The Duke looked at his son and thought that he was well informed. When everyone else fell silent, Belle asked, so what? Let them entrust this mission to him. He will deliver the princess quickly and safely. The Duke looked at him thoughtfully and did not answer, but suddenly Jean called out to Belle. A dark aura immediately thickened around him and Jin, calling him a mongrel, told him not to meddle in business. From the dark aura that emanated from him, the flower on the table immediately withered, and the others became very nervous. Belle clenched his teeth and thought that he felt this greatness. He hasn't seen him for a long time, but still the eldest son is different from everyone else. He clenched his hand into a fist, collected his thoughts, and then called Avalon and said that he was not joking. A sheath appeared in his hand, and he said that no matter who is against him, he will still protect the princess. Jean looked at him with a terrifying gaze and asked with a smile, even if it was him against him. Belle replied emphatically that he would not change his mind. Laser suddenly decided to warn Belle, telling him to be careful. He took it as an insult. Belle looked at him and thought that he was Jean's servant, Laser. Looks like he's a rank B paladin. Jin grinned, his red eyes sparkling, and he said it was interesting. He turned to his servant and said that he should check it. After the order, a weapon also appeared in Laser's hands, and, preparing for battle, he said that he understood. He looked at Belle with irritation and thought, how dare he contradict him? Now he will show him his strength. After that, he sharply rushed forward and disappeared from Belle's field of vision, as if disappearing into thin air. A second later he reappeared, but was already very close. He raised his hand to strike, and Belle became very worried when he saw him so close and cursed in his thoughts. Laser struck, but Belle managed to draw his sword in time and block the attack. Laser was surprised that the child blocked his attack, and Jin grinned. Belle got really nervous and thought he almost missed it. He was faster than he thought. He can't defeat him just yet. They wanted to continue, but suddenly the Duke raised his voice and told them to stop. Belle froze in place, feeling pressure from his father. After this, the Duke calmly said that he was entrusting the mission to Belle. Laser turned around and asked in surprise, "Is he sure about this?" The Duke replied that he thought he was capable of this mission, since Karma had already been destroyed. Laser retreated, and Belle put his weapon away and thanked his father, saying that he would do his best. Jin continued to look at his little brother with a bored look, but suddenly smiled horribly. Time passed, and on a bright sunny day, Belle arrived at the royal palace. He looked around and thought that in his previous life he had not been here. He approached the gate, which was guarded by 2 guards. When they saw the child, they hastened to stop him and told him that he should not enter here. Belle showed them his rank and said that he came here for a mission. His name is Belle Catastrophe. The guards looked at him doubtfully and asked, "Belle? It is he. Is this child a C-rank paladin?" The guard raised his hand to signal the others, and they raised the gate to let Belle inside. He walked inside, and the guards looked after him and wondered, will this child be the princess's guard? But Belle did not pay attention to their words. He confidently walked forward. Ahead he saw a carriage, a princess standing next to her, and knights standing on one knee next to her. The princess saw a child coming towards them and said that she had rather nice guards. She put her hands on her belt and apologized, saying that she wouldn't need it. Meanwhile, somewhere in an unknown place, a young man was sitting on a throne, and his servant was kneeling in front of him. He asked if Reich had already set off. His servant, a young man in a mask, replied that everything was correct. She will be guarded by several knights of the palace and the Duke's son named Belle. The young man asked, "Belle? Catastrophe's youngest son? It seems like he really is still very young. He's quite talented, so keep his guard up. If necessary, he allows him to use it." His servant squeezed several blades between his fingers and said that he understood everything. He smiled and said that killing was his profession. Meanwhile, the carriage set off and they drove out of the castle gates. Belle with the princess and 2 knights were sitting inside the carriage. He thought that they were guards accompanying the princess to the ceremony in Arsh. It sounds simple, but it is a very important mission. He can't make a mistake, all for the sake of his little sister. He turned his gaze to the princess who was looking out the window and thought that he didn't think he was needed here. He decided to start a dialogue with her, asking what does it mean that she doesn't need him. She did not answer immediately, so the sounds of wheels could still be heard inside the carriage. She looked lazily at Belle and replied that she just didn't want to get attached to someone. She looked away from him, folded her arms, and said that she had a weapon. She is not so weak that she cannot defend herself. Belle awkwardly replied that he understood. He thought she was more arrogant than he expected. The princess looked out the window again when they found themselves on a busy street. Outside, merchants sold their wares and some made money from performances. The princess suddenly became interested in the man who was throwing balls and deftly catching them. She moved closer to the window with a smile and looked out onto the street. And Belle, seeing this, smiled and laughed. The princess immediately looked at him and frowned, asking what was wrong with him. He apologized and said that he was just remembering his little sister. She repeated incomprehensibly, "Sister?" He replied that his sister would have reacted the same way. The princess became interested in him and after a short pause asked if they play often. Belle confirmed her words and added that they do this often. She is still small, so for now they play at home together and so on. Reich tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked out the window again, saying that for her it was the other way around. She has many brothers in the palace, but she can only trust herself. The sun had already begun to set behind the horizon and Belle, looking at the orange sky, thought, are they all fighting for the title? He said that everything was the same for him. Their older brothers and sisters bully them because they are children of another woman. Their mother died, so only they can protect themselves. The princess remained silent and turned her gaze to him, and Belle smiled at her and said that, unfortunately, he understands how lonely she is. If she needs something, then let her not hesitate to ask him about it. She looked away from him again and replied that she was not going to count on anyone, especially at him, and let him not speak as if he understands everything. It's disrespectful to her. Meanwhile, at the gates of the city to which they were heading, a group of people in masks with hoods was hiding. Time passed, night came, The carriage arrived at its destination, and someone said that, as planned, they got there in a day. The princess got out of the carriage and stretched her lower back, saying that she was so tired from the trip. The iron gates rose with a creak and several knights, led by a fair-haired young man, approached the carriage. He called Lady Reich and welcomed her here. She asked who he was. He answered her with a slight smile that he was the leader of the knightly group, Peter Fred. He thanks her from the bottom of his heart for coming to them. Belle looked at him and thought, Peter Fred. It seems familiar to him. He began to look around the surroundings and thought that this was somehow strange. They met them outside the city. He fixed his gaze on the foliage of the trees, but everything around was quiet. At this time, a group of people hiding behind the bushes began to act. The knightly group and the princess, along with her escort, remained standing in place, without saying a word to each other. Belle felt something was wrong. He thought that there were a lot of guards here, but something was wrong. Suddenly, a man sitting on a tree threw a sharp knife straight towards the princess. Belle noticed the glint of the knife's blade and thought that the princess was too easy a target outside the castle. He summoned the sheath and quickly knocked the knife away, protecting the princess. She was frightened by his sudden attack, and after that she and her knights realized that they were under attack. Sharp knives flew at them from all sides, and someone shouted that this was an enemy attack. All the sharp blades flew straight at the princess. It was an attack that she could not avoid. Belle looked at the sky and thought there were so many of them. Peter immediately rushed to his defense, drawing his sword from its sheath and shouting that they were scoundrels. He approached the princess and with quick swings of his sword began to reflect all the knives in the sky. His gaze became stern, and he said that he would not let them touch the princess. Belle pursed his lips and frowned, thinking, was he able to fight off that many knives? Is this a rank B skill? The attackers began to descend from the trees and walk away, and Peter, as soon as he noticed this, shouted to the others that they were leaving. He stood in front of the princess and waved his hand, telling the knights to catch them immediately. They will hide the princess in the palace. Belle agreed and remained at the gate, while Peter led the princess into the castle. As she was led away, she gave Belle a worried look. After a while, they reached some warehouse and took the princess there. The knight said they were safe here. The area around the palace is protected by his colleagues. The princess folded her arms across her chest with displeasure and said that they didn't need to protect her. She could handle it herself. The knight exclaimed that this was impossible. Even if it costs them their lives, they will still protect. But he did not have time to finish. His neck was cut by a sharp blade. The knight's body immediately fell to the floor. His armor rustled from the fall, and the princess looked in shock at the corpse in front of her. The killer turned out to be Peter, who was holding a sharp blade in his hands. Reich became very nervous, realizing that she was trapped, and froze in place. Peter closed his eyes and asked, even if it costs them their lives? He smiled and said that their life was too cheap. The princess, with fear in her eyes, asked who he was. Peter looked at her and let out a questioning sigh, and then smiled widely and said syllable by syllable that he was a killer. From the horror that the princess felt, her legs gave way and she fell to the floor. Peter began to slowly approach her, and she crawled back, looking at him in horror. She stretched one hand forward and wanted to summon a weapon, but nothing happened. Her hand was trembling violently. Peter looked down at her and with a crazy smile told the princess to say goodbye with her life. Cold sweat appeared on Reich's face. She was so scared that in her thoughts she asked someone to save her. Suddenly someone responded to her plea. The glass broke and the corpse of a man flew inside. Peter immediately turned around and asked displeasedly, "What is this?" He looked down and saw the corpse of one of the attackers at the gate. A second later, Belle appeared in the window, his blue eyes sparkling in the darkness, and the moonlight behind him made its way into the room. This light illuminated Reich's face, which no longer felt fear and looked at Belle in surprise. He smiled when he noticed her gaze and told Lady Rika that he had come. He thanks her for waiting. The princess said his name in surprise, and after that he jumped off, finding himself inside the room, and said that he would figure it out himself. Peter tutted displeasedly and said that he thought the guards were far away. Strange, but he realized that he was the enemy. He's great. Belle replied that he just remembered about him. Peter frowned and asked what he remembered. Bell replied with a confident smile that his name was Von Legal. Hearing this, Peter, that is, Von, was very surprised. He clearly did not expect this. Bell said he uses 3 sets of lightning bolts as weapons. His former targets Count Slave, Bermont, and Marquis Reisenbart. Von frowned and nervously asked how he knew all this. Bell answered him in his thoughts that he had caught him in a past life. He said that he did not think that he would decide to kill the princess. He won't be able to hide behind the head of the knights. Von clenched his teeth, looked away and thought, what should he do? Suddenly he laughed and told Bell that he hardly knew him. Does he think he will surprise him with his rank? Bell agreed and said that it would be difficult for him to defeat an opponent with a B rank, but with him it was a completely different matter. Von immediately took out his knives, placing them between his fingers, and exclaimed, "Who does he take him for?" Bell frowned and thought that the first attack was throwing knives. As Bell thought, Von suddenly waved his hands and threw all the knives at him at once. Bell concentrated and began to quickly dodge, crouching and moving to the side. He thought that at the same time he would run closer. Von suddenly approached him and swung his knife, and Bell dodged and thought that he was now throwing a slanting blow. Von was surprised to see him easily avoiding his attacks. He abruptly moved behind Bell, but he already knew about it. He summoned the weapon and thought that he was attacking now. Von wanted to attack, but Bell blocked his blow and said that he knew all his movements in advance. Von remained silent and thought, how does he manage to react? Bell smiled and said that he could kill him whenever he wanted. But if he wants to live, then let him give up. Von froze in place, comprehending his words. Suddenly he let out a chuckle and then got angry and shouted loudly that he would destroy him. Bell smiled. He got the reaction he wanted from him and thought that his blows would become weak due to the fact that he succumbed to emotions, and this was his flaw. Von began to attack, and Bell began to dodge, following his movements. First there is a push, then a cut, followed by an oblique blow, and only after that he throws a knife. Then he will carry blows from below. I know all this, Bell continued to evade, and the princess looked at him in surprise and thought that he was so small, but was already coping with the killer. Von, meanwhile, attacked again, and Bell easily parried the blow with his sword. Reich continued to watch him and thought that she was only complaining. The gem on her ring sparkled in the moonlight, and Bell sharply swung his sword and shouted that this was the end. Immediately after that, he lowered his sword. Von missed this moment and received a blow. Blood sprayed from his wound. Feeling pain, he decided to increase the distance and looked at the enemy, gritting his teeth. He thought that he knew all his movements. He won't get there. Everything is as he was told. He remembered the young man's words that he had talent, so let him be on his guard. Suddenly he smiled and said that it was time for a backup option. Bell frowned and thought, is he talking about the ability of weapons of rank B and above? The ability is that he can make a stopping electric barrier. Deciding to take a defensive stance, he told Von to attack. He would be able to withstand his strength. Von took out a bottle of potion and asked with a grin, is this true? He uncorked a bottle with a blue potion inside, and Bell noticed this and was surprised. Von drank the contents and said that he seemed to know about the tears of the Dragon King. As soon as he swallowed everything, he threw the bottle away and it hit the wooden floorboards with a thud. The potion he drank began to take effect. Von grabbed his chest and felt a surge of strength in his chest. Bell became nervous and thought it was a very rare item. If you drink this, your magical power increases several times. It will be bad if he uses this technique. Von took out his blades again, and sparks began to swirl around them. He smiled and told Bell to regret not killing him. Then he sharply swung both hands, sending the blades flying, and they headed towards Bell, leaving a sparkling trail behind them. Bell concentrated, looking at the sparkling blades, and then prepared to parry the blows. But suddenly all the sparkling blades froze in the air around Bell. They sparkled even more, and Von smiled and said that he was caught. The blades that were around Bell imprisoned him in a thunder cage, causing him to rise into the air. Bell became very worried and thought that his body rose because of this. Reich, meanwhile, crawled to the wall and worriedly called out to Bell that she had fallen into a trap. At this time, he called upon the shield of Achilles, which began to protect him from sparks, and then ordered the weapon to destroy everything here. Wind currents swirled around the weapon, but this did not help him. Suddenly, he realized that in the barrier, the wind would simply circle around and curse loudly. Vaughn smiled when he saw this, and then ordered the thunder to thunder. The daggers that surrounded Bell suddenly sparkled even more, and then many lightning bolts appeared in the barrier. They all shocked Bell, and he screamed in pain and could not defend himself in any way. Vaughn laughed and told him not to be afraid. Now he will finish him off. Bell's eyes began to roll back from the endless lightning strikes, and he thought that he shouldn't die now. Suddenly, ice arrows flew from the side and hit the blades, displacing them to the side. Because of this, the thunder cage immediately collapsed and Bell was free. Vaughn was very surprised to see this, and then he turned towards the direction from which the arrows were fired. He saw the princess who had managed to summon her divine weapon and was now pointing her bow at him. Reich said that the knight sacrifices his life, in which case she should not be afraid. Vaughn got very angry and shouted that she was just a nasty girl. He sharply jerked towards her, pointing the tip of the knives forward. Seeing this, the princess became very worried and did not know what to do next, but Bell is now free. He rose to his feet and thanked the princess, and Vaughn, hearing his voice, stopped and turned around. But he didn't have time to do anything. Bell immediately swung his sword and inflicted a sweeping wound all over his body. From such a wound, Vaughn's eyes rolled back. Blood gushed from his mouth and splattered Bell's face, whose eyes were staring at him. Vaughn lost consciousness and died, his body falling to the floor. After that, Bell smiled and walked up to the princess, asking if she was okay. She looked at him with a sad and guilty look and did not answer. She got up from the floor and walked towards him, and then put her hand on his cheek and said that he was a fool. He himself is covered in wounds. She sighed and apologized for dragging him into a squabble over the inheritance. He smiled and said that there was nothing wrong with it. By the way, she is really strong. Reich smiled at him and said that compared to him, it was not like that at all. She thanked him and said that if he was in danger, she would definitely help him. Hearing this, Bell knelt in front of her with a smile and thanked her, and she smiled tenderly. After that, she took the ring off her finger and said that he should take this one. She put the ring in his palm and said that it was her respect. Bell's face changed when he saw what the ring was. On his palm lay a silver ring with a blue gem. Time passed. After the end of the mission to escort the princess, Bell returned home. He went into his father's office and knelt before him, and he said that he had finally returned. He heard everything. He successfully protected the princess. Bell confirmed his words and said that he had completed the mission. The Duke suddenly looked down and noticed something on his hand. He looked at the ring and asked, "Is this Solomon's ring?" Bell also looked at the ring and replied that the princess gave it to him as a sign of trust. The Duke thought that Solomon's ring was one of the treasures passed down from generation to generation by kings. They say this ring has special magical powers, and the princess gave him such a valuable thing. This boy is quite difficult. He smiled and said that he would soon need to enter Athena. Bell looked up at him in surprise and repeated, "Athena?" He thought that this was a school for paladins. It is an establishment frequented by paladins of recognized family lineage. In the Catastrophe family, children are usually taught by teachers at home, but the applicant for the head of the family must go to school and socialize. That is, this is the path to future inheritance. Bell told his father that everything would be as he said. The Duke said that when the time comes to act, he will notify him, while he rests. But Bell was in no hurry to leave. He turned to his father, and he asked what was wrong. Bell immediately straightened up and looked at him with a smile, and then said that he had one more request for him. Time passed. The doors to the new living room opened and Sarah ran inside, circling around the room with her arms outstretched. She was very happy and asked, "Is this her room now?" She jumped onto the bed with joy, and Bell said that her father allowed it. He thought that since their father moved them into the main mansion, they were no longer cramped. Sarah lay down on the bed and told Bell that she was so grateful to him. But suddenly her joy evaporated when she noticed that something was wrong with his hand. She saw the wound and worriedly asked what it was. "He is okay?" Bell calmly replied that he simply cut himself during the mission. Sarah touched his wound with concern and began to mutter something with a sad expression on her face, and then suddenly threw her hands up and told the pain to go away. Belle laughed and thanked her, saying that he was no longer in pain. He patted her on the head, and she laughed contentedly. After that, Belle thought she was being treated better, but he had to decide what to do first. In 5 years, another duke will start a war against them. She could be in danger again. To save her, he still needs to learn a lot of things. And for this, he needs to become the next head. Time passed. Leeser entered the dark room of Jean, who was sitting in the center and drawing mountains on canvas. Lazar knelt before him, greeting him. Jin remained silent. He continued to draw and applied a stroke to the canvas. Laser said that unfortunately he has sad news for him. The Duke decided to give young Mr. Bell to Athena. Jin remained silent, and Lazar continued, saying that this is the first time that someone other than him will be sent there. A title war could break out. Before it can begin, he has something for him. Jin interrupted him and told him to leave him alone. He put the brushes and palette on the table and, looking at the resulting picture, said that now he was not a threat to him. Laser wanted to object, but Jin interrupted him and said that the fact that he was getting better was only to his advantage. A dark aura suddenly began to emanate from him, which caused the paints on the canvas to flow down in drops. He touched the canvas that had not yet dried with his palm, and Laser was surprised by his next action. Jin slapped his face sharply and then lowered his palm down, leaving a trail of paint on his face, and said that he liked to break something that was already finished. Laser became nervous and replied that he understood him. After the conversation, he left his room and headed forward along the corridor, thinking that no matter what Jean wanted, it was dangerous to leave Belle. He has several weapons and defeated a rank B knight at that age. He sped up and thought that just in case, he needed to do something. Time passed. Belle sat on a huge empty platform and held a sword in his hands. He thought that now his priority was weapon skills of rank B and above. If he can unlock them, he will have a big advantage. To do this, he needs to defeat high-rank monsters. He doesn't have that much time. In the reflection of the blade, he noticed a silhouette that was hastily approaching him. He immediately turned around and saw that it was Lazar. Laser came closer to him and greeted Belle, and he rose to his feet and said his name in surprise. After that he asked, "Did your brother ask for something?" Lazar suddenly clenched his hands into fists, but Belle didn't notice. Then he bowed and said that he was sorry for what had happened recently. It was impolite of him to draw his sword on the Duke's son. Belle was slightly surprised and thought, "What's wrong with him? He's so polite." He replied that everything was fine, don't worry. Laser bowed to him again and said that he was grateful from the bottom of his heart. And he has another conversation with him. Belle repeated, "Conversation?" He became wary and gripped the hilt of his sword tighter, and Laser asked if he could go with him on a mission to destroy the monster. Belle repeated suspiciously, "Mission?" Laser said that the other knights, including Jean, had other plans, but after seeing his results, he would like to ask him for help. Belle thought it was strange. Why does Servant Jin ask him for help? As the son of a duke, he cannot refuse the mission, but he better be on his guard. He replied that he understood everything. He agreed. Lazar bowed again and thanked him for his help. While he did not see his face, he grinned and thought that now, under the pretext of a mission, there was only one thing left. Belle interrupted his thought by asking, "So what next? Where does he need to carry out his mission?" Laser replied that he needed to arrive at a place near the remote area of Meldia Ithaca. Belle was surprised and repeated in his thoughts, "Ithaca?" He suddenly smiled and thought that this was where he needed to go. There he could increase his magical power.